Welcome to Nice and Blunt. My name is Adam Riancho, and it's time for another wide receiver rankings video. These are my top 30 for 2024, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, these are the top 20. If you're looking for a more individual breakdown on all of these players, you can check out the videos on my channel. But we're going to hop in to wide receiver 21, where it's a new tier altogether. I have 9 receivers in this following tier. I think wide receiver 21 is arguably just as good as wide receiver 29. So we're going to move forward. At number 21, I have a DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. DJ Moore was a top 12 receiver in 2023 with 14.1 points per game. He played all 17 games, saw 8 targets per game, 5.6 receptions per game, 81 yards per game, and scored 9 touchdowns. But all 9 of those touchdowns did come with Justin Fields as his quarterback. He was definitely elite when Fields was under center. In those 12 games, he actually scored 16.8 points per game with an average 94 yards per game. On the flip side, he was terrible with Tyson Bagent at quarterback. Not only did he not score a touchdown, he only caught 5 catches per game for 53 yards per game and averaged 7.8 half PPR points per game. So really a tale of two seasons. The backup quarterback, Bagent, really screwed him over. But it's hard to say which version of him we're going to get in 2023 because on one hand, he gets a quarterback upgrade with rookie Caleb Williams. So you should be expecting more production. But on the other hand, he gets far more target competition with Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, and Gerald Everett joining the offense. Last year, his only legit competition was tight end Cole Kmet, who's still with the team, and that's a pretty crowded bevy of weapons in Chicago. I still think DJ Moore is the Bears wide receiver 1, though. He definitely is paid like it. His contract is worth $20.6 million per season, and that ranks 17th highest at the wide receiver position across the NFL. But in terms of pay, Keenan Allen is right there behind him, getting paid $20 million per year. The contract investment is basically identical between the two, but Keenan is only on the books for 1 year, whereas DJ Moore is under contract through the 2025 season, 2 more years in Chicago. So that's why I think Keenan doesn't really worry me that much. He just turned 32 years old. Meanwhile, DJ Moore is 27 in the prime of his career. But honestly, I continue to talk myself into Rome Odunze being the most valuable based on his cheapest price tag among the 3. Odunze was an elite college prospect. He was drafted 9th overall alongside Caleb, and they have reportedly developed an excellent friendship and great chemistry dating back to the combine earlier this year. Because there's a new quarterback, the past production with Chicago actually means nothing, and I'm a little worried that as the season goes on, Caleb might favor developing a better rapport with his rookie teammate, who's obviously tied to Chicago way more long-term overall. So that's really the only big red flag. I'm not too worried about Keenan, but Rome does concern me. But I don't really expect Williams to actually play favorites. I think whoever is open, whoever's hot in a given game is going to get the ball the most. So DJ Moore should remain the first read on the majority of routes. But with this crowded offense, I do expect the overall fantasy value to come down. The touchdown production probably not going to be as high as 9 touchdowns in 2024. So that's why DJ is in this tier, not inside my top 20. I think we're probably looking at a projection much more similar to his first 4 years in Carolina, where he notoriously was giving you 1,200 yards from scrimmage every single season, but failed to surpass 4 touchdowns in any of those years. So that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to fully endorse DJ at his price. I want to put him in the previous tier alongside guys like Cooper Kupp and DK Metcalf, but I just can't. I think there's too much competition in this offense to fully commit to DJ Moore as a top 20 receiver. But I still think you're going to get pretty good numbers from him. I think 2019 is a very good year for him to look at when projecting for 2024. He had 135 targets. That feels about right this season. He would be putting up 7.9 targets per game, 5.1 receptions per game, 71.5 yards per game, but only 4 touchdowns would equal an average 11.1 points per game. So touchdowns are going to be the biggest factor for his success this season. If he goes over 7, you're going to be very happy with him. If he is under 4, like if it's only 3 or 2, that is going to suck. So 11.1 points is my projection for him, which last year was tied for wide receiver 25 on a per game basis. As I mentioned, this tier that he's in extends all the way to wide receiver 29. But the reason I have him at the top is because of his durability. DJ Moore is extremely reliable. He's missed only 2 games in his 6-year career. And for the last 3 consecutive seasons, he's played all 17 games every single year. So the lack of injury risk, I think, is a big tiebreaker for me in this tier, and it's why I have him as my wide receiver 21. He's good, but he might be a little disappointing if those touchdowns don't hit. At number 22, though, a player I am ecstatic about, super high on, is Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. Technically, Tank Dell played 11 games last year, but he got injured after 9 snaps in Week 13 with no targets, so let's throw that game out and show you his 2023 stats in 10 full games, and damn, are they impressive. He averaged 14.2 points per game on 7.5 targets per game, 4.7 catches per game, 76 yards per game, and also scored 7 touchdowns. He was prolific. We also know that rookies usually start off slow, so if we cherry pick even more and look at the final 4 games, holy shit, these numbers skyrocket. He was getting 10.8 targets per game, 6.3 receptions per game, 99 yards per game, and scored 5 touchdowns. That's an average of 20.6 half PPR points per game. He was on pace to be a league winner going undrafted last season. If he did not break his leg against Denver, oh, what could have been. But reports indicate his recovery went very well, and as early as March of this year, he was already running at full speed. He also got shot this offseason, but he's fully recovered from that as well, and he appears to be 100% heading into training camp. So the biggest red flag for him is not his health. It's really the fact that they traded a second-round pick for Stefon Diggs, formerly of the Buffalo Bills. As well as upgrading their running back talent with Joe Mixon, there are a lot more weapons in this offense to compete with, and Diggs' presence on the field really muddies the waters on this depth chart. It's hard to accurately predict what the target share will look like on a weekly basis. I can't say for sure if the Texans are just going to stay in 11 personnel, keep all 3 receivers on the field the entire game, or mix and match with mostly 2 wide receiver sets. But regardless, we know for a fact that CJ Stroud is going to air it out every single week, and there's a lot of upside. You want a piece of this passing game, especially with the upside that Tank Dell showcased last season. So I'm genuinely tempted to rank Tank Dell as the number 1 guy here above Nico Collins, who I have at number 10 in my rankings. But if not for the contract extension that Nico signed this offseason, I probably would. But given Diggs is on a 1-year rental and is known for being a headache in the locker room, definitely a diva, I absolutely prefer drafting Tank Dell as the wide receiver 2 in Houston's offense. Tank Dell is actually going behind Stefon Diggs. I just think all 3 are probably going to be a little more volatile this season. When they hit, it's going to hit big. When they don't, you'll probably be a little disappointed with less than 10 points. But I don't think it's crazy to project 10 plus touchdowns for Tank Dell. I think that's definitely within the range of outcomes. I think that's probably the most likely scenario if he can stay healthy. But with his profile of 5'8", 165 pounds, that's the only reason I don't have him ranked inside my top 20. I kind of want to rank him top 15, to be honest with you. I'm tempted to bring him up and bring Nico Collins down. I love Tank Dell, and it sounds like CJ Stroud does too. But at wide receiver 23, I have Zay Flowers, who was the wide receiver 32 in points per game last season. He averaged 10.4 points per game, but as a rookie, his stats were far different in the second half of the year, especially once Mark Andrews went down with injury. So in the first 10 games with Andrews on the field, Flowers was just a floor play, averaging 8.7 points per game. He didn't really do too much, 56 yards per game on 5 catches, but only scored 1 touchdown. That was the big problem for him in terms of fantasy success. But once Andrews got hurt, his volume actually didn't change at all. In the final 6 games, he saw 6.7 targets, caught only 4.5 receptions. That was actually less than the first 10 games, but put up 60 yards per game. The efficiency did go up, but the touchdowns finally hit. He scored 5 touchdowns in this 6-game sample size, which led to 13.2 points per game. Touchdowns were critical for him last season. So without them, he's really just a consistent floor play that's barely getting you 9 points. But I don't really read into the early season production that much. I think, as is the case with pretty much every rookie, they're usually a lot better in the second half of the year, and that's usually a lot more emblematic of their sophomore seasons in the league. So I think we're definitely going to be closer to that 13.2 average this year than that 8.7 average, especially given he put up his best game of his career in the playoffs when he caught 5 of 8 targets for 115 yards and a touchdown against the Chiefs. That was a game he notoriously fumbled into the end zone. He could have scored a second touchdown without that fumble. So he cemented himself as one of, if not the Ravens' best weapon. The only question is, will his red zone role repeat like it did in those final 6 games, or will it revert back to terrible efficiency in that regard with Andrews back healthy on the field? I think you're going to be fine. I find it hard to believe he just completely disappears, but I also think his 17-game pace of 14 touchdowns is unsustainable. So that variance of 3 to 15 touchdowns is a wild margin of difference, and we're really just optimistic with this ranking. Assuming it evens out, you're probably going to be fine with his ADP. He's going off the board as wide receiver 26, pick 35 overall. And at that price, I do think he's undervalued, but I have him ranked here at wide receiver 23 because I think 1,000 receiving yards in a run-first offense is probably his ceiling. I have a hard time believing you're going to get 1,300 plus yards from Zay Flowers when Lamar Jackson is his quarterback and they added Derrick Henry to this backfield. Last year, he was only competing with Gus Edwards for touchdowns, and that could be a big problem. So as long as Mark Andrews isn't hogging all of the touchdowns himself, Zay Flowers is definitely going to be fine, and I do have him ranked above his ADP of wide receiver 26. At number 23, I think he's a good investment. But at wide receiver 24, there is a lot to be excited about when it comes to George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. When the Steelers traded away Deontay Johnson, Pickens immediately became the alpha wide receiver in this offense, and they only drafted Roman Wilson out of Michigan in the 3rd round, and I don't think he's really going to be established. There's reports that Van Jefferson is actually currently above him on the depth chart. So Pat Freiermuth and Jalen Warren remain the only threats for targets in this offense, and that means 10 targets or more per game is definitely possible for George Pickens this season. We also have a sample size that we can look to last season where Pickens played without Deontay Johnson on the field, and from weeks 2 through 5, Pickens was the clear number 1 receiver and was a top 10 option in fantasy. He averaged 14.5 points per game. He saw 8.3 targets per game, caught only 4.3 receptions per game, but on 21.6 yards per reception, he averaged 93 yards per game. He also scored 2 touchdowns. He was fantastic. It is worth mentioning, though, that in Week 5, Pat Freiermuth was also unavailable due to injury, and that was a game where he saw 10 targets, caught 6 of them for 130 yards and a touchdown. But it's also worth noting that Pickens' best game of the year was actually in Week 16 versus the Bengals, where he turned 6 targets into 4 catches, 195 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and both Deontay Johnson and Freiermuth were active and healthy for that game. So it was just a matter of Mason Rudolph getting him the ball down the field like he actually is the best player that the Steelers have. I think by far and away, he is their best, most talented weapon. And when you consider 14.5 points per game was tied with Puka Nacua last year for wide receiver 7 on a per game basis, I want to go all in on George Pickens and rank him inside my top 20. But then I remember the fact that Russell Wilson is his new quarterback, and despite throwing 10 touchdowns to Cortland Sutton last year, Sutton only finished the season tied for wide receiver 32 with only 10.4 points per game. So that's where I'm like, damn, I don't know if I can fully buy in, but Pickens is definitely way more talented than Cortland Sutton, straight up. But then you also remember that Arthur Smith is a far worse play caller than Sean Payton, and this Russell Wilson-Arthur Smith combo is why I ultimately have to pump the brakes. But even then, I am higher on Pickens than ADP. There's going to be some games where Pickens unlocks that massive yak potential and does put up top 10 numbers. I think his ceiling is top 5 in any given week. But even Drake London went for 125 yards versus Washington last year and 172 yards versus Tampa Bay as well. But those were two of the best wide receiver matchups in the NFL last season. So we're really just hoping for good matchups. When that happens, Pickens is going to dominate. But London has only scored 6 touchdowns combined over the last 2 years with Arthur Smith, not to mention the fact that Kyle Pitts is also super talented and has only scored 6 touchdowns in 44 career games with Arthur Smith over 3 years as his head coach. So that is why I'm worried Arthur Smith is going to rob us of the true breakout season that George Pickens deserves. And I'm going to stay conservative and only project 6 touchdowns next season for George Pickens. But I do think we're going to see a very high floor from a yards per game standpoint. I think 80 plus yards per game is definitely possible. And if Pickens stays healthy, I have him projected for 12 points per game this season. And that's on the conservative 6 touchdowns I just mentioned across 12 games. So here's my projection: 12 points per game on 8.3 targets per game, 4.3 receptions, 77 yards per game, and 6 touchdowns. That's the volume he got when Deontay Johnson was hurt last season. So even though I'm high on Pickens as my wide receiver 24, he could still massively outperform this ranking if he is able to score 10 plus touchdowns. But with Arthur Smith, I think that's probably unlikely to happen. I think he's a must draft though in the 4th round, especially in best ball where you don't have to predict when those spike weeks are coming. When they do, he can give you 35 points in any given matchup. So you're drafting him at his floor, in my view, on Underdog with an ADP of wide receiver 27, pick 39 overall. I will say this though, if he gets hurt, if he misses a majority of the season, this Steelers offense literally has no other weapons, and it's probably going to look like one of the worst in the league. That's one of the reasons why I'm so low on the Steelers this season. They have a very brittle situation, and it all hinges on the success and health of George Pickens. Most weeks, it's probably not going to be enough to win. So I think you want to draft Pickens, and I'm hoping he stays healthy. If he does, I think wide receiver 25 is absolutely a safety net for him. It's just going to be kind of volatile, kind of up and down in terms of production. But number 25 in my rankings is Amari Cooper, and we all remember Amari Cooper's close to the season last year. He was elite, especially in week 16. He caught 11 of 15 targets for 265 yards and 2 touchdowns. He scored 44 fantasy points, but that was with Joe Flacco as his quarterback. So that really juiced his 15-game average of 12.7 points per game. Flacco is now gone. Meanwhile, he was replaced with Jameis Winston. So there's a decent safety net if Deshaun Watson goes down with injury again, but there's just a lot of pressure on Watson to stay healthy in Cleveland. Last year, Deshaun only completed 5 games in 2023, so let's take a look at this sample size for a more accurate projection of what Amari Cooper is likely going to put up in 2024 with that quarterback. In those 5 games with Watson, Cooper averaged 11.4 points per game. He saw 8.4 targets per game, caught 5.4 receptions per game for 75 yards per game, and only scored 1 touchdown. That was a big problem for his ceiling. So from a floor standpoint, he was very, very safe. You were getting a 10-point floor from Cooper every single week, regardless of the touchdown, but a touchdown rate of 0.2 per game is only going to lead to like 3 or 4 over a 17-game sample size. So that is where I think there is a little bit of concern for Amari Cooper and his upside, but there's also a concern that his target share does come down because David Njoku really established himself in the back half of last year as a go-to target in this offense. The Browns also traded a 5th and 6th round pick for wide receiver Jerry Jeudy, a former 1st rounder, and they also signed him to a 3-year $52.5 million extension, which keeps him in Cleveland through the end of 2027. However, Jeudy is notoriously just a guy, and is someone who I've believed in and has burned me year over year. I don't really think he's a big threat in this offense for targets. But Amari is in the middle of a camp holdout. He is looking for a new contract at the age of 30 years old. I think he deserves it. His production was really good last year, and I think he still has plenty left in the tank heading into his 10th career season. But I do think he gets that contract. I don't really worry about him missing any time. I think he's an excellent value going in the 4th round. His ADP is wide receiver 29, pick 40 overall. And as long as he's back on the field in week 1, I think you're drafting him at his floor at that price. So if he puts up the same numbers as he did last year with Deshaun, then 11.4 points per game would give you the wide receiver 25 on a per game basis. And this is exactly where I rank him. And that's assuming the low touchdown rate of only 0.2 per game continues. If it somehow increases to 0.5 per game, then we'd be looking at 8 or 9 touchdowns next year. And in that scenario, his average would jump to 13.2 points per game. And now you're looking at wide receiver 15 on a per game basis. So Cooper is a very safe pick with tremendous upside, league winning potential if those touchdowns hit. And it's really hard to find a safer option than Cooper in the 4th round or later. I love his ADP. I draft him a lot. But right behind him at wide receiver 26, I have T. Higgins, who is another very safe pick in round 4. His underdog ADP is essentially tied exactly with Amari at pick 40 overall. And whichever one you prefer of the two is really just going to boil down to personal preference. I think you can make a case for either of them being ranked above the other. But the reason I have Higgins ranked 1 spot lower is because he was actually a massive letdown last season. He was in and out of the lineup with injuries. He only played 12 out of 17 games and only averaged 9.7 points per game. That was tied for wide receiver 38 on a per game basis. He was being drafted at like pick 25 a year ago, and he was a bust if you paid up to get him. I don't think he suddenly just got washed, though. I obviously think the injury was a big factor, and it wasn't just an injury to him, it was also the injury to Joe Burrow. If you look at the final 5 games with Jake Browning as his quarterback, he did improve. He averaged 11.7 points per game with 3 touchdowns in that sample size, but 2 of those games happened with Jamar Chase injured and out of the lineup for at least portions of those matchups. So that definitely boosted these numbers. But if we look at the games with Browning, they ultimately don't matter. What's more important is the games with Joe Burrow, where he looked like shit. But Burrow was also recovering from a calf injury for the first month of the season, and I don't know how much we can really read into these stats either, as Higgins also got injured himself in week 4. So these are his per game stats with Burrow. He averaged only 8.3 points per game on 7.3 targets per game, 3.9 receptions per game, only 47 yards per game. And he did score 2 touchdowns in week 2, but those were the only 2 touchdowns in this 7-game sample size. And notoriously, he put up a bagel in week 1. Despite seeing 8 targets, he did not catch a single one of those passes. So he was terrible, and if those numbers happen again, you are definitely not going to be happy with drafting T. Higgins at his 4th round ADP. But most likely, with Burrow healthy and T. Higgins also healthy himself, we're going to be looking at a revert back to what he put up on average in his first 3 years. Let's look back to 2022, where he was healthy for 14 games, and remind you of how capable he was. He averaged 13 points per game on 7.8 targets per game, 5.3 receptions per game, 68 yards per game, and 7 touchdowns in those 14 matchups. Last year, 13 points per game would have ranked tied for wide receiver 15 on a per game basis. So if Burrow and Higgins remain healthy, then wide receiver 28 in terms of ADP is a very low projection for what he can actually put up. He would smash that value. So I think the price is baked in for some risk. I don't think he's like a lock to be as good as he was 2 years ago, but he's in a contract season. He is on the tag, and he's very motivated to get paid long-term by another team. I think this is definitely his last season in Cincinnati. They also let go of Tyler Boyd. That opens up 98 targets in this offense from last year. And they also got rid of Joe Mixon. That adds another 64 targets available in this offense. So plenty of those can definitely go towards T. Higgins this year, and he'll probably be way, way better than wide receiver 38 like he was last year. But they also added Jermaine Burton in the draft out of Alabama. He fell to the 3rd round due to off-the-field concerns, but his talent really indicated he was probably worthy of at least a 2nd round pick, if not higher. And there's also 2nd-year receivers Andre Yoshivas and Charlie Jones, who are hoping to carve out more of a role. Burton is the only one I'm really worried about who can threaten his playing time. But even then, the rookie is not a genuine concern. I think Higgins is going to stay on the field for by far and away the majority of snaps. I think just behind Jamar Chase, you're going to see them on the field almost every single play. So I think the round 4 ADP is something you should be very happy about. Definitely draft him at that discount and feel good about it. My rank of wide receiver 26 might still be too low. I think you can also justify reaching on him in the middle of the 3rd round if you really want to. It is within the range of outcomes. He finishes as a top 20 receiver. So number 26, definitely feel comfortable with him. Like I mentioned, 21 through 29 are all in the same tier. But these last 3 players in the tier, I think, are all overvalued at their ADP. They're the ones I want the least, despite their upside. And speaking of upside, Malik Nabers has elite potential. The 20-year-old rookie out of LSU had a massive junior year last season alongside Jaden Daniels and Brian Thomas. He caught 89 receptions for 1,569 yards and scored 14 touchdowns in 13 games. He's 6 foot tall, 200 pounds, runs a 4.4 40, and his best comp is Jamar Chase. He's an electric athlete, and it's no wonder the Giants drafted him 6th overall back in April. Personally, as a Chargers fan, I was a little bit disappointed when they passed on him for Joe Alt. That is probably a conversation for a different video, though. He instantly plugs in as the true alpha on a team with a concerning lack of talent after letting go Saquon Barkley in free agency. And if he stays healthy, I think he's going to see just as many targets probably as Marvin Harrison Jr. this year. 150 targets kind of feels like his floor. That's 8.8 targets per game. And with Darren Waller also retiring, the next best options they have are Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton, and Devin Singletary. No one else is a threat to steal volume from Malik Nabers. I also think that the game script might benefit him. I'm not a believer in the Giants offense this season. I think they're going to be trailing almost every single week, and that's going to lead to a lot of pass attempts. They're definitely going to need to throw it in order to compete. So I love the volume upside for Malik Nabers, but the reason I have him ranked 16 spots below Marvin Harrison is because of his quarterback. Daniel Jones is a borderline starter in the NFL. He's probably more suited as a backup. They overpaid him on a 4-year, $160 million contract last year, but only $81 million of that is actually guaranteed. It's very likely that the Giants move off of him this offseason if they want to, and I would be shocked if they don't cut him. So on one hand, Malik Nabers is going to see a shit ton of volume immediately, but on the other hand, how much is that volume actually worth? I don't think it's really that big of a deal. He'll probably get bracketed on 90% of his routes, and as someone who predicts less than 5 wins for the Giants next season, I have a really hard time to envision more than 5 touchdowns for Nabers next year. When he does score, I think it'll mostly be on house calls, which gives him like 20 plus point upside any given week. But when it doesn't hit, I think he's going to be a big liability in your lineup. I think 8-9 points is probably going to be his ceiling, and that's going to be the best case far more often than not. So counting on Nabers every week feels like a liability that I don't want to bet on unless it's best ball. I'm not genuinely trying to target him ever on my fantasy team. I think drafting Kyren Williams, Cooper Kupp, or even Derrick Henry is a much better use of a 3rd round pick. At least on Underdog, I even prefer Tank Dell going several spots later. So all of those players I just mentioned have lower ADPs, and that's why I almost never take Nabers. I'm really not a fan, at least this year, with Daniel Jones as his quarterback, and I'm definitely passing in redraft. I think you're going to regret that pick. On a weekly basis, I think he burns you far more often than not. So maybe I'm too low, but I'd much rather be a year late on Nabers than a year too early, and that's why I think his ADP of wide receiver 19, pick 26 overall, is a hard pass. I suggest you don't draft him. Speaking of a pass, I have Michael Pittman Jr. as wide receiver 28 in my rankings. He is 26 years old and just signed a 3-year, $70 million extension this offseason, and he is clearly the Colts' #1 wide receiver. Last year, he was very productive. He played in 16 games, averaged 12.1 points per game, saw 9.8 targets per game. The volume was there. He also caught 6.8 receptions per game for 72 yards per game, and also scored 4 touchdowns. He was one of the best floor plays in fantasy last season, but the problem with these numbers is that it's hard to feel confident that they repeat because he played over 75% of his snaps with backup quarterback Gardner Minshew. Minshew is now in Las Vegas. Anthony Richardson is back as the Colts starter, ready for year 2. Richardson didn't even finish all of the 4 games that he started last year, but when we isolate Pittman's stats with Richardson, it's not encouraging. In those 4 games, he only averaged 9.8 points per game on 8.8 targets per game, 5.5 catches per game for 55 yards per game, like 10 yards per catch is nothing special, and he only scored 1 touchdown. That's not encouraging. 9.8 points per game would have ranked as wide receiver 38 on a per game basis last year, and the biggest knock on Richardson coming into the league was his lack of reps in college, so missing 13 weeks of his rookie campaign doesn't really fix any of those concerns. I do think Richardson is going to be better, especially as the weeks go on, but his upside is really just linked to his rushing ability, and especially near the goal line, I don't think there's going to be many targets available for Pittman. So what's worse about this 4-game sample size is the fact that Jonathan Taylor was also off the field as well. We have never seen this offense operate with its top 3 weapons, Richardson, Taylor, and Pittman, healthy together. So I'm a believer in Shane Steichen and the Colts this year. I do have them projected for 10 wins. I think they are a wild card team, but I'm mostly betting on the run game being the reason why they get there, and that's why I'm mostly trying to bet on Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson in this offense. I think Pittman is overvalued. He's still a pretty decent floor play. I think he'll be a consistent top 30 receiver, but I'm not convinced that he can score touchdowns at a high rate. Last year with Minshew, he only scored 4, and that's why I'm passing on him at his ADP of wide receiver 24. Pick 33 on Underdog. I think he is overvalued. At best, he's in the same tier as other wide receivers going in the 4th, like Pickens, Cooper, and Higgins that I just mentioned. I am way more excited about. And in a worst case scenario, he actually loses a lot of volume because Josh Downs is fully healthy in year 2. He might take a step. And now rookie wide receiver A.D. Mitchell is a big upgrade over Alec Pierce, who ran some of the most routes of any receiver in the NFL. So they're definitely going to eat into the target share this season. Downs was on and off the field with injury, and I just don't see the same type of role repeating for Pittman. I think the most likely scenario where he actually finishes top 20 next season is if Richardson goes down and we see backup quarterback Joe Flacco airing it out and sending 10 plus targets his way every single game as his favorite target. That is possible, but it's not a bet I want to make. So overall, I think Pittman is a bust candidate among the wide receivers being drafted in round 3. I would rather just let him fall back around in round 4. And even then, I kind of would rather take guys like Laporta, Kelsey, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and some of the receivers I just mentioned like Dell, Pickens, Amari Cooper. So I suggest you pass on him. I kind of just want to remove him from my board entirely. He is basically on my do not draft list. But at number 29 in my wide receiver rankings, I have Stefon Diggs, and he is my biggest bust candidate this season in this tier. I'd say he's probably the most difficult player to rank. I could genuinely talk myself into ranking him top 15 in a best case scenario, but I think he's also a candidate to finish outside the top 35 because of how crowded this wide receiver core is in Houston. We know the Texans offer elite upside. Both Tank Dell and Nico Collins averaged 20 plus fantasy points per game when they saw 8 plus targets per game. And that's why I still have Diggs ranked inside my top 30, but I think he's going to be the odd man out in this offense. There are going to be games where Diggs is the best target and does see over 8 targets, definitely pops off for more than 20 points. I think the upside is definitely a factor. I think that's a lock to happen week 5 when the Texans host the Bills in Houston, but you can't really convince me that it's going to happen more often than not. I just don't think he's the priority number 1 target in this offense. I understand that they traded a 2nd round pick to get him, but it wasn't even in this year's draft. It's going to be in next year's draft, and it's not like he's the focal point of the offense. He's just the cherry on top so that they can maximize this Super Bowl window while CJ Stroud is still on a rookie contract. Maybe they bring him back next season, but I think more likely than not, he's auditioning for another team and will play elsewhere in 2025 when his contract is over. He turns 31 in November, and that age is a factor I just can't dismiss. They just paid Nico Collins a big contract. Tank Dell has an excellent friendship and chemistry with CJ Stroud. The two of them love each other, and Diggs is notoriously a locker room headache and one of the biggest diva wide receivers in the league. So I feel like there's a scenario where they get fed up with him, and as the year goes on, they start to phase him out of this offense, and that would look a lot like what we saw last year in Buffalo. If we look back to 2023 with the Bills, Diggs had a tale of two seasons. In his first 10 games with Ken Dorsey as the coordinator, he was amazing. He averaged 16.5 points per game. He scored 7 touchdowns on 10.2 targets per game, 7.3 catches per game for 87 yards per game. He was a top 6 wide receiver at that point. But once they fired Ken Dorsey and shifted to Joe Brady, Diggs was basically poison for your fantasy lineup. He averaged a terrible 7.9 points per game during those final 7 games, only scored 1 touchdown, was getting 8.3 targets per game, but only caught 4.9 receptions per game for 46 yards. He didn't even give you 10 yards per catch, and some games he just completely disappeared. He was almost as bad as Gabe Davis. So I think last year is pretty emblematic of what you're going to get from Diggs this season. I think when he goes off, you're going to have a 20+ point potential, but more often than not, you're going to be struggling to get 8 fantasy points per game, and that's going to be a big headache deciding whether or not to start or bench him in your weekly lineup. I think he's a much better pick in best ball, where you don't have to make that decision. It's just automatic. In redraft, I think you're going to be pretty annoyed with Diggs on your team. So that's why I'm not drafting him if I'm taking a Houston receiver this year. Of all 3, I'm targeting Tank Dell the most. He has the cheapest price, but I definitely think Nico offers the most value. I have him ranked the highest. So good luck if you do draft Stefon Diggs. Personally, I'm not going to do it unless I get a massive discount and he's on the board towards the tail end of the 4th round. But the last player in this video, my wide receiver 30, is the first player in a new tier, and he is one of the least exciting picks in the league. I'm talking about Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's not exciting at all. He's definitely unsexy, but he's probably the safest pick as well. He got injured on the first play of the game in week 13 and missed the rest of the season, but in his first 11 games last year, he was actually wide receiver 25 on a per game basis with an average of 11.2 points per game. He was seeing 7.6 targets per game, caught 5.1 receptions per game for 70 yards per game, and also scored 3 touchdowns. Him and Calvin Ridley were actually averaging the exact same fantasy points per game. The difference was Ridley was extremely boom bust, and Kirk was the image of consistency. He was getting you almost the exact same production week in, week out. So if all you're looking for is a double-digit floor, I think Christian Kirk is an excellent flex play, but if he's your wide receiver 2, I think you're going to be kind of disappointed. And these numbers are pretty much identical in 2022 when he played a full season with Trevor Lawrence. His first year in Jacksonville, he averaged 11.9 points per game. So 11 to 12 points on a weekly basis is what Christian Kirk offers you. And while he did get hurt last year, both him and Trevor Lawrence are 100% healthy going into training camp this year. So there's no reason at all to believe that Christian Kirk all of a sudden falls off a cliff. I think he will repeat these numbers in 2024. And there's also some optimism because Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones are no longer with the team. They've replaced them with Gabe Davis in free agency, as well as Brian Thomas Jr. with pick 23 in this year's first round. Gabe Davis, just a deep threat. I don't worry about him at all. But to be honest with you, I think Brian Thomas is by far the better value of the two. He's going 2 rounds later, and I think before the year is over, there's a chance that Thomas overtakes Kirk as the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense. Thomas is far more explosive. He's 6'3", 209 pounds, runs a 4.33 40, and last year at LSU caught 68 receptions for 1,177 yards and 17 touchdowns as a junior. So I love Brian Thomas. I think he was absolutely worth that first round pick, and I draft Thomas almost 3 times as often as I take Christian Kirk because you can get a 2-round discount, and I'll be honest with you right now, I have Brian Thomas in the very same tier. Just a few spots lower, I have Brian Thomas as my wide receiver 33 next season. So I'm actually super underweight on Christian Kirk. I know he's a very safe pick, but on Underdog and Best Ball, I want the upside, and I also hate his ADP price. There's a lot of really good players going even later. ETN has literally like a straight up identical ADP as Christian Kirk. If I'm picking between these two Jags, I absolutely want ETN over Kirk straight up. And I also prefer guys like Pacheco, Mahomes, Lamar Jackson. Like, you can't tell me that even Andrews, Kincaid, or Trey McBride are not as valuable as Christian Kirk. So the only reason to draft him, in my opinion, is if you made a mistake in the first 3 rounds and now you're like desperate for receiver depth in round 4, and because you ignored the position, you're just forced to take him because you have no other options at receiver. So I suggest passing on Kirk. I think it'd be a lot more justified if he was going late round 5 or like early round 6, but late round 4 I think is just too expensive. I'm not trying to draft Christian Kirk. So these last 4 players in the video I think are all fades for me, not players I'm targeting at all. But the top 6 I think offer really good value, and I definitely want them if I can get them. At number 21, I got DJ Moore, followed by Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, George Pickens, Amari Cooper, T. Higgins, Malik Nabers, Michael Pittman Jr., and Stefon Diggs. All 9 of those players are in the same tier. And lastly in this video, first player in tier 7, I have Christian Kirk as wide receiver 30. But that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And let me know in the comment section where you agree and disagree. I'm happy to take the criticism and hear what you think. But my name is Adam Riancho. I'll see you next time in the next video. Thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.